Paper snaps, a pencil breaks. Somewhere underground, a telephone rings and rings, then dies into static. Adolf Hitler's world is shrinking by the hour, but the real panic isn't the enemy outside. It's the men inside. Hermann Göring waiting for permission to survive. Heinrich Himmler betting on betrayal. Martin Bormann sealing doors and sealing fates. Joseph Goebbels whispering loyalty like a spell. Stamped orders, burn bags, last-minute signatures that smell like fear. Because every empire ends the same way. Quietly, in rooms with no windows, where powerful men suddenly discover they're mortal. And tonight, the inner circle learns something worse than defeat. There is no safe exit, and someone is already choosing who disappears first. The corridor hums with generators as a courier in a damp greatcoat is shoved into a cramped records office. A wax seal cracks under a trembling thumb, red imprint, black eagle, the stamp of highest secrecy. Martin Bormann stands over a steel desk lamp, eyes flat, as Adolf Hitler's adjutant lays out a folder of names. Joseph Goebbels arrives without a coat, breath sharp in the stale air, glancing once at the phone as if it might accuse him. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl hover near a wall map, boots planted, faces tight, waiting for a sentence that won't come. Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler's liaison steps in, too calm, offering a second envelope. Unsigned, marked for special handling. On the far end of the table, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's telegram is read aloud, then folded with deliberate care. Joachim von Ribbentrop's note sits unanswered, ink already drying into irrelevance. Albert Speer points to a production ledger, trying to speak in numbers, while Walther Funk stares at the stamp pad like it's a verdict. A clerk slides in thin files: Rudolf Hess, Wilhelm Frick, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Fritz Sauckel, Franz Halder, Walther von Brauchitsch, names arranged like ammunition. Someone mutters Reinhard Heydrich under their breath, and the room goes colder. Another hand writes Ernst Kaltenbrunner and underlines it twice. On a side table, naval dispatches from Grand Admiral Erich Raeder and Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz sit beside an army situation report initialed by Colonel General Heinz Guderian. Pinned to a board are casualty summaries that read like a countdown: Erich von Manstein, Gerd von Rundstedt, Erwin Rommel, Walter Model, Albert Kesselring, Günther von Kluge, Fedor von Bock, Friedrich Paulus, each name a different kind of ending. Bormann presses the stamp down, one dull thud, then another, approving transfers, cancellations, instructions to destroy after reading. The telephone finally rings again. Keitel reaches for it, then stops. Goebbels watches his hand hover, not moving, as if the next voice on the line will decide whether they live long enough to sign the last page. This is the story of how they all died. Not the battles, not the strategies, the endings. Every man in that room, and the generals scattered across a collapsing front, faced a final reckoning. Some chose their own deaths, some were hunted down, some walked to the gallows, and a few, improbably, outlived the regime that made them powerful. But no one escaped judgment. Not really. The question wasn't whether the end would come. The question was what kind of end. And for the men who built the Third Reich, the answers were as varied as they were damning. To understand how they died, we need to understand what they were fighting for in those final weeks. By April 1945, the war was lost. Everyone knew it. Soviet forces had crossed the Oder River and were preparing the final assault on Berlin. American and British armies had punched across the Rhine and were racing east. The Wehrmacht was a skeleton of its former self. Units existed on paper that had no soldiers left to fill them. Fuel was gone. Ammunition was rationed. The Luftwaffe could barely put planes in the air. And yet, in the underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler still issued orders as if victory were possible. He moved divisions that no longer existed. He planned counterattacks with troops that had already surrendered. And around him, the inner circle watched, calculated, and began making their own arrangements. But there was a problem. Loyalty to Hitler wasn't just expected, it was enforced. To show doubt was to invite suspicion. To suggest surrender was to risk execution. So the men who had spent years carrying out Hitler's orders now found themselves trapped by them. They couldn't surrender, they couldn't flee, and they couldn't admit what everyone already knew. The 1,000-year Reich was dying after just 12 years. The first cracks appeared not in Berlin, but far from the front lines. And they began with a man who had already been out of the inner circle for 3 years. Rudolf Hess had been Adolf Hitler's deputy, the third most powerful man in Germany, until May 10, 1941. On that night, he climbed into a Messerschmitt Bf 110 fighter and flew solo to Scotland on a self-appointed peace mission. He believed he could negotiate with the British, end the war in the West, and free Germany to focus on the Soviet Union. It was, by any measure, a spectacular miscalculation. The British had no interest in negotiating. They arrested Hess immediately and kept him imprisoned for the rest of the war. Hitler was furious. He declared Hess insane, stripped him of all titles, and erased him from the party's official narrative. For the next 4 years, Hess sat in British captivity while the regime he helped build marched toward destruction. What no one knew then was that Hess's flight had sealed his fate in a different way. By removing himself from the war before its worst crimes were committed, he created a strange legal limbo. When the Nuremberg trials began in 1945, prosecutors struggled to determine exactly what Hess was guilty of. He had helped build the Nazi Party, he had signed discriminatory laws, but he had been locked in a British cell during the Holocaust, the death camps, the mass executions. The tribunal ultimately convicted him of conspiracy to wage aggressive war and crimes against peace, but acquitted him of war crimes and crimes against humanity. His sentence, life imprisonment. Hess would spend the next 42 years in Spandau Prison in Berlin. For the first 2 decades, he shared the facility with other convicted war criminals. But one by one, they were released. Albert Speer walked free in 1966. Baldur von Schirach followed the same year. By 1966, Hess was alone. The prison that had once held 7 men now housed only 1, a single elderly prisoner guarded in rotation by American, British, French, and Soviet troops. The Soviets refused every appeal for his release. They had lost 27 million people to the war Hess had helped start. They were not inclined toward mercy. On August 17, 1987, Rudolf Hess was found dead in a garden summerhouse on the prison grounds. He was 93 years old. The official verdict was suicide by hanging. He had wrapped an electrical cord around his neck. But his family disputed this conclusion. They pointed to his advanced age, his arthritic hands, the difficulty of the act. Conspiracy theories multiplied. Some claimed he was murdered to prevent him from revealing secrets. Others suggested British intelligence silenced him. The truth remains contested. But the undisputed fact is this: Rudolf Hess was the last prisoner of Spandau, and his death marked the final closure of a facility built to hold men who had tried to rule the world. Hours later, the demolition crews arrived. Spandau Prison was razed within weeks, its bricks ground to powder and scattered in the North Sea. The Allies wanted no shrine, no pilgrimage site, no place where admirers might gather. Rudolf Hess died as he had lived since 1941, isolated, forgotten by most, a relic of a regime that had moved on without him. But Hess's strange half-escape from the inner circle was the exception. For the men who stayed, the endings came faster and with far less ambiguity. Consider Reinhard Heydrich, the man whose name made that crowded records office go cold. By 1942, Heydrich was perhaps the most dangerous man in the Nazi hierarchy. He ran the Reich Main Security Office, which controlled the Gestapo, the criminal police, and the intelligence services. He had chaired the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. where the bureaucratic details of the Holocaust were coordinated, and he served as acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, occupied Czechoslovakia, where he combined brutal repression with strategic concessions to maximize war production. Hitler called him the man with the iron heart. Others simply called him the Butcher of Prague. On the morning of May 27, 1942, Heydrich's open-topped Mercedes slowed for a hairpin turn in the Prague suburb of Holešovice. He was on his way to the airport, traveling without adequate escort because he believed the Czechs were too cowed to attempt anything. He was wrong. Two agents, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, had been trained in Britain and parachuted into Czechoslovakia months earlier with a single mission: kill Reinhard Heydrich. Gabčík stepped into the road and raised his Steen gun. It jammed. For a frozen moment, Heydrich could have ordered his driver to accelerate and escape. Instead, he did something inexplicable. He stood up in the car and drew his pistol, as if to confront his attackers personally. Kubiš threw a modified anti-tank grenade. It exploded against the rear wheel, sending shrapnel and debris into Heydrich's body. He staggered from the car, fired several shots at Kubiš, then collapsed. At first, the wound seemed survivable. Surgeons removed shrapnel and fragments of the car's upholstery from his spleen. Heydrich appeared to be recovering. Then, on June 4th, he suddenly collapsed. He died within hours. The cause was sepsis. Infection had spread through his body, likely from horsehair stuffing in the car seat that had been driven into his wounds. Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, was killed by an infected splinter. The Nazi response was immediate and catastrophic. Hitler ordered massive reprisals. The village of Lidice, falsely linked to the assassins, was razed to the ground. All men over 15 were shot. Women were sent to concentration camps. Children were taken for Germanization or killed. Similar atrocities struck the village of Ležáky. Across the Protectorate, an estimated 5,000 people died in the reprisals. Gabčík and Kubiš, along with 5 fellow agents, died in a firefight at a Prague church on June 18th after being betrayed by a fellow resistance member. Heydrich's death removed one of the most effective and ruthless administrators from the Nazi hierarchy. Some historians argue it disrupted the machinery of the Holocaust at a critical moment. Others suggest his replacement, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, proved equally brutal. But no one disputes the symbolism. Even the man with the iron heart could be reached, and Kaltenbrunner would face his own reckoning soon enough. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the men in field grey were learning a different lesson. For the generals who had conquered France in 6 weeks and driven deep into the Soviet Union, the war had become a grinding retreat. And some of them had begun questioning not just the strategy, but the strategist himself. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood Hitler's Germany better than most. He had been a favorite, showered with praise and promotion after his exploits in North Africa. The Desert Fox had become a propaganda hero, his image used to project German military genius to the world. But by 1944, Rommel had seen enough. The D-Day landings on June 6th confirmed what he had privately feared. The war was unwinnable. Allied material superiority was overwhelming. Every tank Germany lost was irreplaceable. The Americans could ship 2 more across the Atlantic. Every pilot killed meant a training program that no longer had fuel. Rommel told his aides the war must be ended. The question was how. What no one knew then was that Rommel had been drawn into the orbit of the conspiracy against Hitler. The exact nature of his involvement remains debated. Some conspirators claimed he was willing to support a coup. Others said he opposed assassination but favored arresting Hitler and forcing a negotiated peace. What is certain is that after the July 20th, 1944, bomb plot failed. After Klaus von Stauffenberg's briefcase exploded in Hitler's conference room but left the Führer alive, the Gestapo investigation began uncovering names. And one name mentioned repeatedly was Erwin Rommel. By October 1944, Rommel was recovering at his home in Herlingen from wounds suffered when a British aircraft strafed his staff car in July. On October 14th, Two generals arrived at his door with an ultimatum from Hitler. Rommel had a choice: stand trial for treason before the People's Court, where conviction and execution were certain, where his family would be arrested and his reputation destroyed, or take poison. If he chose suicide, Hitler promised a state funeral with full military honors. His family would be protected. His name would be preserved. Rommel chose the poison. He said goodbye to his wife and son, climbed into the general's car, and was driven a short distance down the road. 15 minutes later, one of the generals called from a local hospital. Rommel had died of an apparent brain seizure, they said. The cause was a cyanide capsule he had bitten down on in the back seat. The state funeral was held as promised. Hitler sent a massive wreath. The official announcement blamed Rommel's death on his earlier wounds. The lie held for years. Only after the war did the truth emerge. Nazi Germany had forced its most famous general to kill himself rather than risk a public trial that might reveal how deeply the rot had spread. Rommel was not alone. Other field marshals faced similar reckonings, though the circumstances varied. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge commanded Army Group Center and later the Western Front. He too had been in contact with the July 20th conspirators, though he wavered at the critical moment and failed to support the coup. After the plot collapsed, he was relieved of command and summoned back to Berlin. On August 19, 1944, somewhere near Metz, his car stopped by the roadside. Kluge swallowed a cyanide capsule. He left a letter for Hitler defending his military decisions and insisting on his loyalty. It was the letter of a man who knew his survival was impossible and hoped to salvage something for his family. Hitler read it and reportedly threw it aside. Field Marshal Walther Model was different. He had no involvement in any conspiracy. He was, if anything, one of Hitler's most loyal commanders, a defensive specialist who had stabilized collapsing fronts multiple times. In April 1945, his Army Group B was encircled in the Ruhr pocket by American forces. Surrender was inevitable, but Model could not bring himself to capitulate. A German field marshal does not surrender, he told his staff. On April 21, 1945, in a forest near Duisburg, he walked away from his headquarters, drew his pistol and shot himself in the head. His body was not discovered until later. He was buried in a makeshift grave that remained unmarked for years. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock had commanded the drive on Moscow in 1941 and led Army Group South before being relieved over strategic disagreements with Hitler. By 1945, he was retired and living with his family in Schleswig-Holstein. On May 4, 1945, just days before the German surrender, British aircraft attacked a convoy on the Kiel-Lübeck road. Bock, his wife, and his stepdaughter were all killed in the strafing. He died not by suicide or execution, but by the random violence of a war that no longer distinguished between soldiers and civilians. But while some field marshals chose death over capture, others made different calculations. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had commanded the Sixth Army at Stalingrad. In January 1943, Hitler promoted him to field marshal precisely because no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was meant to ensure Paulus would fight to the death or take his own life. Instead, on January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered to the Soviets. Hitler was apoplectic. He raged that Paulus should have shot himself. The propaganda ministry declared him a traitor. Paulus spent the rest of the war in Soviet captivity. Initially, he refused to cooperate with his captors. But gradually, he changed. He joined the Soviet-sponsored League of German Officers and began making radio broadcasts urging German soldiers to surrender. Was it genuine conversion? Coercion? Survival instinct? The answer depends on who you ask. After the war, Paulus testified for the Soviet prosecution at Nuremberg. He was released in 1953 and chose to live in East Germany, where he lectured at military academies and defended his decisions at Stalingrad until his death from motor neuron disease in 1957. He never returned to the West. He never faced trial. He died in bed. the only German field marshal to surrender and survive. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, widely considered the Wehrmacht's finest operational mind, was captured by the British in 1945. He was tried in 1949 for war crimes, specifically for the conduct of troops under his command on the Eastern Front. He was convicted on some charges and acquitted on others, sentenced to 18 years, then repeatedly had his sentence reduced. He was released in 1953 and spent the next 2 decades as a military consultant and memoirist. His book, Lost Victories, became a bestseller and helped shape the post-war myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the notion that the regular German army had fought honorably while atrocities were committed by the SS. Historians have since dismantled this myth, but Manstein himself never faced full accountability. He died in 1973, at 85, having outlived the regime, the trials, and most of his critics. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt followed a similar path. He had commanded the Western Front, been relieved, recalled, relieved again, a pattern that reflected both his military competence and his willingness to voice unwelcome truths to Hitler. After the war, he was held by the British as a potential war crimes defendant, but his health declined and he was released in 1949 without trial. He died in Hanover in 1953, largely unpunished. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring commanded German forces in Italy and later the Western Front. He was tried by a British military court in 1947 and sentenced to death for ordering the execution of Italian civilians in reprisal killings. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment after protests, including from Winston Churchill. Kesselring was released in 1952, officially for health reasons. He died in 1960, having written his memoirs and maintained that his actions were legally justified under military occupation rules. The pattern was clear. Among the field marshals, those who survived the war often survived the peace. The trials focused on specific war crimes, and proving command responsibility was difficult. The Cold War created new priorities. West Germany needed officers to rebuild its military, and many former Wehrmacht commanders found roles as advisors. The reckoning, such as it was, fell most heavily on those who had been in Berlin when the end came. And in Berlin, the end was coming fast. By April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery had become a tomb in waiting. Soviet artillery could be heard above. The power flickered. The air was thick with diesel fumes and the smell of too many people in too small a space. Hitler emerged briefly to review a group of Hitler Youth defenders, boys really, some as young as 12, then retreated underground for the last time. What no one knew then was that the inner circle was already fracturing. Hermann Göring, who had fled Berlin for southern Germany, sent a telegram on April 23rd asking whether Hitler's decision to remain in Berlin meant that Göring should assume leadership of the Reich. It was an attempt at succession, clumsily worded. Hitler interpreted it as betrayal. Martin Bormann, who had long sought to undermine Göring, seized the opportunity. Within hours, Hitler had stripped Göring of all offices and ordered his arrest. Göring was detained by the SS at his estate in Berchtesgaden. He expected execution, but the guards who held him were uncertain. The chain of command was disintegrating, and Göring was, technically, still a field marshal. When American troops arrived on May 9th, they found Göring cooperative, even cheerful. He surrendered with luggage, staff, and an apparent expectation that he would be treated as a fellow military professional negotiating the post-war order. He was spectacularly wrong. Heinrich Himmler's betrayal was more calculated. The Reichsführer SS, the architect of the concentration camp system, had been attempting to negotiate with the Western Allies for months. Through Swedish intermediaries, he had offered a German surrender in the West while continuing to fight the Soviets, a proposal that demonstrated both his desperation and his failure to understand Allied politics. The Allies were committed to unconditional surrender. They had no interest in Himmler's offers. On April 28th, A BBC broadcast revealed Himmler's negotiations. Hitler erupted. He denounced Himmler as a traitor and stripped him of all offices. He ordered Himmler's liaison in the bunker, Hermann, who was also Eva Braun's brother-in-law, executed by firing squad in the Chancellery Garden. The shooting happened within hours. Himmler himself fled. He shaved his mustache, donned an eye patch and a private's uniform, and tried to lose himself among the millions of displaced Germans wandering the collapsing Reich. On May 23rd, he was stopped at a British checkpoint near Nuremberg. His papers identified him as a demobilized sergeant. But something about his manner made the guards suspicious. They detained him for further questioning. Under interrogation, Himmler revealed his identity. Perhaps he expected better treatment. Perhaps he believed he could still negotiate. Whatever his reasoning, the British had no intention of cutting deals. When a doctor attempted to search his mouth for hidden poison, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule concealed in a tooth cavity. He was dead within minutes. His body was photographed, wrapped in camouflage netting, and buried in an unmarked grave on the Nuremberg Heath. The location was deliberately kept secret. Like Spandau decades later, the Allies wanted no pilgrimage site, but the bunker's most significant death came before Himmler's, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. On April 29, 1945, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony in the bunker's map room. They had been together for over 15 years. Though she was rarely seen in public, and her existence was largely hidden from the German people. Now, with Soviet troops less than a mile away, Hitler made her his wife. They celebrated with champagne and conversation while the world burned above them. The next morning, Hitler dictated his final political testament. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the party. He appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, a choice that surprised many, since Dönitz had no political experience. He blamed the Jews for the war. He urged continued resistance. And then, sometime around 3:30 in the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun retreated to his private quarters. She swallowed cyanide. He shot himself in the right temple. Their bodies were carried to the Chancellery Garden, doused in gasoline, and burned. The cremation was incomplete. Soviet troops would later recover fragments, but the symbolism was clear. Adolf Hitler would not be captured, displayed, or tried. He would not face judgment at Nuremberg. He chose his own exit and denied the world the satisfaction of pronouncing his sentence. Joseph Goebbels followed within hours. The propaganda minister had been among Hitler's most devoted followers, and he had no intention of outliving the regime he had helped create. On May 1st, after arranging for a German general to attempt to negotiate with the Soviets, a negotiation that failed, then Goebbels and Magda walked into the garden and either shot themselves or were shot by an SS orderly on their instructions. Their bodies were burned, though less thoroughly than Hitler's. Soviet soldiers found them the next day. The Goebbels family chose to die together rather than face the future. Martin Bormann attempted to escape. After Hitler's death, he left the bunker with a group that included the head of the Hitler Youth, Arthur Axmann. They tried to slip through Soviet lines by following German tanks making a breakout attempt. Near the Weidendammer Bridge, they came under fire. Bormann was last seen alive in the early hours of May 2nd. For decades, his fate remained unclear. There were reported sightings in South America. Conspiracy theories placed him in Argentina, Paraguay, Spain. In 1972, construction workers in Berlin uncovered human remains near the Lehrter Bahnhof station. Dental records suggested the skeleton was Bormann's. DNA testing in 1998 confirmed it. The evidence indicated he had bitten a cyanide capsule, the same method as Himmler, as Göring would later use, as so many of the inner circle chose when capture seemed certain. The manhunt was over, but the myth persisted. Bormann had been so shadowy, so powerful behind the scenes, that many found it hard to accept he had died in a Berlin street on the war's last night. He was sentenced to death in absentia at Nuremberg, a verdict that became moot once his remains were identified. And Nuremberg itself became the stage for the final reckoning. The International Military Tribunal convened in November 1945 with 22 defendants in the dock. They represented the breadth of Nazi leadership: political officials, military commanders, propagandists, industrialists, administrators of terror. The charges were unprecedented: crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, conspiracy. The defendants sat in 2 rows, headphones translating proceedings into German, facing judges from America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Hermann Göring dominated the early proceedings. He had lost weight in captivity. He had been addicted to paracodeine, and detoxification had stripped away much of his bulk. But he remained charismatic, combative, and utterly unrepentant. He sparred with prosecutors. He defended the regime. He tried to present himself as a soldier doing his duty, rather than a criminal orchestrating murder. For a time, it seemed he might rally the other defendants into a unified defense. Then the prosecution showed the films. The concentration camp footage, the piles of bodies, the skeletal survivors, the gas chambers, the crematoria, changed everything. Whatever justifications the defendants had constructed collapsed under the weight of those images. Göring fell silent. The other defendants visibly recoiled. The films made undeniable what words alone could not convey. This was what they had built. This was what they had served. On October 1st, 1946, the verdicts came. 12 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Sauckel, Jodl, Seyss-Inquart, and Bormann in absentia. 3 were acquitted. The rest received prison terms ranging from 10 years to life. The executions were scheduled for October 16th. But Göring cheated the hangman. On the night of October 15th, guards found Hermann Göring dead in his cell. He had crushed a cyanide capsule between his teeth. How he obtained the poison remains disputed. Some believe it was hidden in his personal effects, overlooked during searches. Others suspect a sympathetic guard. A later investigation suggested the capsule may have been concealed in a container of skin cream. Whatever the method, Göring had made his final statement. He would die on his own terms, not the Allies. The remaining 10 executions proceeded the next morning. The hangings were conducted by Master Sergeant John C. Woods, an American Army executioner whose technique has since been criticized. The gallows had a short drop. Some defendants strangled rather than dying instantly from broken necks. Ribbentrop was first. He took 10 minutes to die. Keitel followed. Then Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Sauckel, Jodl, and Seyss-Inquart. Their bodies were photographed to prove the executions had occurred, then cremated. The ashes were scattered in a river to prevent any grave from becoming a shrine. 10 of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany ended as anonymous dust in running water. But not everyone hanged. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and later Minister of Armaments, escaped the noose. At Nuremberg, he adopted a strategy no other defendant attempted. He accepted collective responsibility for the regime's crimes. He did not claim ignorance of the concentration camps. He did not blame others. He said that as a senior official, he should have known, and that not knowing was itself a form of guilt. The tribunal sentenced him to 20 years in prison, severe but survivable. Whether Speer's contrition was genuine remains debated. He later admitted to knowing more about the Holocaust than he acknowledged at trial. His memoirs, written in Spandau, became bestsellers. He emerged in 1966 as a repentant figure, a good Nazi who provided the world with insights into Hitler's personality. He died in 1981 in London during a trip to participate in a BBC interview. He had outlived nearly all the other defendants, and he had done so by being the one man willing to admit that what they had done was wrong. Karl Dönitz, Hitler's chosen successor, served 10 years for waging aggressive war. The tribunal found that his U-boat campaign had violated international law, though his defense, that the Allies had conducted similar unrestricted submarine warfare, was partially accepted. He was released in 1956 and lived quietly in northern Germany, giving occasional interviews in which he maintained that he had simply been a naval officer doing his duty. He never expressed remorse for the regime he briefly led. He died in 1980 at 89. Walther Funk, the economics minister, received a life sentence for his role in financing the Nazi state and laundering gold stolen from concentration camp victims, including gold extracted from the teeth of the murdered. His health collapsed in prison. He was released in 1957 on medical grounds and died in 1960. Erich Raeder, the Grand Admiral who built the German Navy before Dönitz, received a life sentence for waging aggressive war. He was released in 1955, also on health grounds. He spent his remaining years writing his memoirs and died in 1960. The sentences varied, the outcomes differed, but the trials established a principle that had not existed before. Individuals could be held accountable for crimes committed on behalf of states. Following orders was not a defense. Waging aggressive war was a crime. And the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, was not just a tragedy, but a prosecutable offense. There were those who escaped Nuremberg entirely, of course. Heinz Guderian, the panzer general who had revolutionized armored warfare, was interrogated but never charged. He spent 3 years in American and later British custody as a potential war crimes defendant, but no indictment materialized. The evidence of his involvement in atrocities was insufficient, or perhaps the Cold War had already begun reshaping priorities. He was released in 1948, wrote his memoirs, and died in 1954. His book, Panzer Leader, became a classic of military literature, and his reputation as a tactical genius largely survived intact. Franz Halder, the chief of the German Army General Staff from 1938 to 1942, followed a similar trajectory. He had been involved in early plots against Hitler, which complicated his status. He was arrested after the July 20th plot, not as a participant, but as a suspected sympathizer, and spent the final months of the war in concentration camps. After liberation, he became a key source for American military historians, helping to compile the official U.S. Army histories of the German campaigns. He received a Meritorious Civilian Service Award from the U.S. Army in 1961. He died in 1972, having successfully positioned himself as a professional soldier who had opposed Hitler. Wilhelm Keitel, the field marshal who had served as chief of the Armed Forces High Command, had signed orders for the execution of prisoners of war, the killing of Soviet commissars, and the reprisal murders of civilians. He had been Hitler's instrument for translating ideological directives into military orders. His defense, that he was merely following orders, became the very embodiment of what the prosecution rejected. He was hanged, the highest-ranking military officer to be executed at Nuremberg. Alfred Jodl, the operations chief who had worked alongside Keitel, faced the same fate. His conviction was more controversial. Some felt he was simply a staff officer implementing decisions made by others, and the French judge actually voted for acquittal. But the majority convicted him. He was hanged on October 16th. Decades later, a German denazification court posthumously overturned his conviction, finding insufficient evidence of personal criminality. The reversal was itself overturned when later courts ruled the first court lacked jurisdiction. Jodl's legal status remained ambiguous long after his body had been cremated. The trials were imperfect. They were conducted by victors against the vanquished. Some argued they were revenge dressed as justice. Others noted that the Soviet judge sat in condemnation of aggressive war while his own country had invaded Poland in 1939, had annexed the Baltic states, had slaughtered prisoners at Katyn. The moral authority of the tribunal was complicated by the presence of prosecutors whose governments had their own crimes to answer for. And yet, and yet Nuremberg established that some things were crimes regardless of who committed them. It created a record, thousands of documents, testimony, film footage, that made denial impossible. It forced the world to look at what had happened in the camps and the ghettos and the killing fields. It demonstrated that power, no matter how absolute it seems, eventually answers to something. The men who died in the bunker made one choice. The men who fled and were captured made another. The men who stood trial and hanged made a third. And the men who lived on, Speer in his celebrity repentance, Dönitz in his quiet defiance, Manstein in his consultant's respectability, made still another. Each ending reflected something about the man who faced it. Hitler chose suicide over capture because he could not imagine a world where he was not in control. Goebbels chose death because he genuinely could not conceive of life without the cause he had served. Göring chose suicide to deny the Allies their spectacle, to exit on his terms rather than theirs. Himmler thought he could negotiate his way out, then discovered he had no leverage. Rommel was forced into death to preserve an illusion. Model chose death over surrender because his identity as a soldier could not survive the alternative. Paulus chose life and became a Soviet propaganda tool. Speer chose contrition and bought himself decades. There is no single story here, no neat moral. The endings were as varied as the men. Some showed courage, some showed cowardice. Some showed calculation, some showed nothing at all, just the animal instinct to survive or the animal instinct to die. What remains is the record. 23 names on a board, casualty summaries that read like a countdown, a telephone ringing in a bunker, and a hand that hesitates to answer. Somewhere in that hesitation, in that moment before the next voice speaks, is the entire history of how empires fall. Not with battles, necessarily, not with treaties, but with individual men in individual rooms, facing individual choices they never imagined they would have to make. The telephone finally stops ringing. Someone has to answer for what comes next. If this story left you thinking, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Every view, every share, every comment helps bring history back to life. Hit the notification bell, and the next chapter of the war finds you before anyone else.